should put my headphones on. Oh,
I'm just, hey Marta, just calling these sessions like little trauma mini courses
thanks.
for
Hi.
you guys. And we just started recording, so that's all set. We did record the first one as well, so if you missed that one, I'm actually going to be sending out the slides for that once I can figure out how to put those into a PDF and send out. But the recording also is available, but I have to like directly send that to you. So if you want to see that one or miss part of this one and need it, just email me and let me know which one you need to get the link for. Okay. All right. So,
Mel,
yes, ma'am.
can you do it presentation?
Yeah,
Slide?
I'm
We
going
can,
this.
yeah.
Yeah, from card slide. How's that? Seeing it? Okay. All right. Last time we met, we talked about some general information about trauma, single incident trauma as compared with multiple incident trauma, and a little bit of the basics underpinning some of the theory. Today, I really want to talk a little bit about complex PTSD, dissociation, and then introduce y'all to a book that was written by Bessel van der Kolk. Some of you may have already heard of it, maybe even read it, but I want to make sure everybody knows about that resource. So we'll talk about a little bit of that, what van der Kolk shared with us in his book. And then if we have some time, we'll get into part of the neurobiology PowerPoint. I don't think we'll finish all of that this morning. I have to stop. I have a hard stop at 10:15 today for a very important reason. I have to jump online and order Bonnie Raitt tickets. And I want to be at the very front of the line because she's one of my favorites.
Can I go?
What's that? Can you go?
Can I
Sure.
go?
You
Okay.
sign on with me at 10 o'clock. It's Bonnie Raitt and Jimmy Vaughn, I think. So that's going to be, it's in not until the fall, but like I said, I really like her music a lot. So I'm going to try to jump on and get good tickets. And it's Friday, so I'm sure everybody will welcome having 15 extra minutes to, get ready for the next meetings. Okay, so we've got complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I need to say up front that that is not a diagnosis that appears in the DSM. The short story on that is that a lot of us clinicians in the field have lobbied very hard for them to add complex PTSD as a diagnosis, but because it's so different than simple PTSD, like what we expect when somebody has a single incident trauma or that startle reflex and all the hypervigilance and things like that we come to think of with PTSD. Complex PTSD often looks very different. And I think as we talk about it, you'll recognize numerous of our clients because these set of symptoms often come when somebody has experienced a lot of childhood trauma or repeated interpersonal trauma. So like think trafficking, think domestic violence, think, childhood abuse and or neglect. So um, the work group that looked at whether or not to add the diagnosis apparently thought because there's an overlap of some of the symptomology with simple PTSD that they didn't need to add a second diagnosis, which is unfortunate because what tends to happen in practice is that people get diagnosed with a personality disorder like borderline personality disorder and maybe like depression or anxiety, um, or maybe PTSD. But what I see a lot is that people get diagnosed with the personality disorder aspect of this and not the trauma. So it's still an unfortunate situation in our field. Apparently, the work group on what to do about borderline personality and complex PTSD actually got so dysfunctional because work group people were arguing so much that they disbanded the work group before making any real headway. So, what are you going to do about that, right? So, anyway, complex PTSD is really when we think about how trauma affects us in every aspect of our being. We talked about that a good bit last time, that it affects our emotions, it affects our thinking patterns, it affects our physiological patterns. It even affects our belief system, how we think about ourselves, other people, and the world. You might remember we kind of talked about that as the trauma worldview. If I have a really negative sense of myself, a lot of distrust and paranoia about other people, and a feeling like the world is a bad and dangerous place, that all taken together we would call a trauma worldview. And that basically means that if anybody's familiar with schema therapy or schema theory, like the way we look at the world and ourselves and like the lens we look through is actually completely influenced by our traumatic experiences. And that makes sense, right? I mean, we go through these things. We talked about the fact that if something is considered like a true trauma, like a traumatic experience, it is in some ways life changing. It changes who we are. And, when we're working with survivors, it's important to acknowledge that, yeah, we're not going to be able to go back to who we were before the trauma. Like, that's not a very realistic goal. But more so, we have to figure out who are we now in the aftermath of that trauma, work on the symptomology that's really kind of causing our current day life to be less than satisfying, right? Less than functional. And then we figure out, like, who am I now? And so when we get to stage 3 work, we'll talk about sort of the post-traumatic growth idea, because I do think that having gone through stuff gives us some things that we have to work through, certainly, but it also gives us some unique insights into people and the world, and can give us, in an ideal sense, like a deeper empathy and compassion for other people who've gone through stuff or are going through stuff. So it's kind of like one of those things that sometimes there's some silver lining to experiences. And going through the treatment, the counseling, the working on our trauma actually helps us in some ways get more healthy than people who never do therapy at all. So it sometimes is the impulse to get us into therapy is to heal these particular experiences, but it actually helps us make our life better to do counseling and treatment in so many other ways. So that's just kind of a little plug for it helps us to do the work. So complex PTSD is kind of like if you take some of the trauma symptomology from PTSD and some of the symptomology from personality disorder, especially borderline personality disorder, and sort of smosh them together, you'll see these sort of symptoms, because you have things like the dysregulation of our affect, which is our emotions. Like, we have a hard time, staying calm and stable especially when things become stressful. We get very, they call it dysregulated or discombobulated, or, just very upset more easily than a person who hasn't had these experiences. So we usually have what we would consider a lower threshold for being triggered, a lower threshold potentially for anxiety or those kinds of reactions. Anger too. We sometimes have a shorter fuse if we're walking around with complex PTSD than a person who doesn't have any PTSD at all. We also may have like things going on in our body and our physiology that are more activated because we'll talk about this more in the neurobiology, but because we are more easily triggered and have the flood of reaction that happens when we're triggered, our bodies are sort of inundated with those stress chemicals and hormones on a more regular basis. And we develop more even physical health issues as a result. We also may have aspects of dissociation, and we're going to talk about that specifically. They call it preoccupation with the perpetrator, and it can be about the perpetrator themselves, but I also see sometimes just like people being almost like, I can't stop thinking about my traumatic experiences and the people who hurt me. And it's sort of all consuming focus on the past, like, and the past and the current if it's still going on, but like not this idea of like sometimes people will say, oh, you just need to get over it. And that is not it's almost impossible for somebody with complex PTSD who hasn't done their own healing process yet to just be like, okay, I'm just gonna not think about that anymore, and I'm just gonna move forward and set positive goals and try to do that. Like, it continues to intrude on us when we haven't dealt with the things that we've gone through. We also, and in part of the trauma worldview stuff, we talked about a negative self-perception. So this is really key for complex PTSD. That negative self-perception with shame, guilt, and or just thinking really, really, and to call it low self-esteem is doesn't capture it fully. I mean, it is a really, really negative sense of self that can really get in the way of even like when we talk about, in cognitive therapy, we talk about like taking a negative self-statement and then using like a challenge statement, like, is that true? Yes or no, and then evidence to the contrary. But when the self-concept is really, really strongly negative, the person often dismisses evidence to the contrary. Like, it's almost like they can't hear it or believe it because their belief about themselves is stronger than the facts of the current day. Because trauma, it creates a lot of interpersonal wounding. Relationships often are shallow or lack trust or are just very guarded, really, is the way it often comes across. Because the person is trying to self-protect because they've been wounded and hurt interpersonally so much. And all that disconnection and negative self-concept can really create a lot of feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. So you can see a lot of suicidality, depression, and really, yeah, hopelessness is the word that comes to mind. So really important that we help people work on these issues, because obviously that the situation of complex PTSD can be very impactful in a person's life and prevent them from moving forward with to realize their purpose and, meaning in life. Like, who am I, what am I put on this earth to do and become? And what is my unique gift and contribution to the world? All that can get really bogged down with the trauma symptomology. So when we talk about dissociation, it exists on a continuum from, and everybody dissociates to some degree. Everybody dissociates sometimes. Some people might already be dissociating this morning if you zoned out while I was talking about anything particular and started daydreaming about something else. That is dissociation on a non-clinical level. If you've ever been driving and it's a routine path that you take and you realize, oh man, I'm already almost home and I don't even remember turning making the last three turns that I always make. You weren't in a fugue state, but you were dissociating a little bit. You were on autopilot. So that's normal dissociation. And you even though you can't quite remember those aspects because you weren't paying attention, you didn't store those memories, you were dissociated. But when you when you came back to reality, you kind of like, oh, I zoned out for a minute there, and now I'm back in the here and now. When somebody is highly dissociative at the other end of that continuum, is what we call like losing time, right? And that can be like a person saying, I know, I left your office yesterday afternoon and like I don't even know what happened. Like all of a sudden it was the next day and I I don't know what I did. I don't know where I went, right? Now, of course, it's important that we differentiate like people not remembering stuff because of substances versus people not remembering stuff because of dissociation. But that is one of the elements that we might hear about, or people who just feel like, I know I did this. I know I wrote something in my journal, but then I looked at my journal and I see what I wrote, and then there was somebody else wrote all sorts of other stuff, but it was in my handwriting. It's a very unnerving experience for people when they realize that they were doing things in an altered state. And it's an altered consciousness. It doesn't mean that the person, I mean, they're conscious, they're moving about in the world, but they are so dissociated that they can't recall it when they are in their primary consciousness. So at that far end of the continuum, we would be talking about whether or not the person meets the criteria for a dissociated identity disorder. Okay, so normal dissociation, like we all do at one side, and sort of like clinically symptomology disorder at the other end of the continuum. Um, I want to normalize dissociation in the sense that it starts as a coping mechanism. So a person, especially a little person, young person who is in an experience of abuse that they cannot escape, the one place we can escape into is our mind. And children in particular are very skilled at daydreaming and dissociation, and mentally like checking out. It sometimes is their only available survival strategy. So dissociation is not the enemy. It's not bad. It can be highly disruptive in somebody's life, but we always want to honor it as what it started out as is a survival coping mechanism. Um, and when somebody is highly dissociative, you can almost totally count on the fact that they've gone through really intense, significant trauma. We don't become that dissociative from everyday events. And sometimes the person might not even remember their trauma. They've completely dissociated the memory of that trauma away. And that would be considered amnesia about the trauma. So on the bottom of the slide here, it says BASC. So when we go through traumatic events and they're so overwhelming that we can't cope with them, we tend to splinter off aspects of the experience so that we can manage what we need to deal with in the moment. And the most common thing that we splinter off is some of the emotional load of the event. So sometimes survivors of different types of trauma will be able to talk about an event really matter of fact. And sometimes we wonder, oh, they didn't seem that affected by it. But actually, sometimes they're so affected by it that they have basically like compartmentalized the emotion for that experience, and they've locked it away. It's still there. It's still influencing their behavior, but it's not like consciously in the forefront of their mind. So BASC is an acronym that stands for behavior, affect, sensation, and knowledge. So if we splinter off knowledge, then we have amnesia about the trauma. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, I don't even remember anything before 8th grade," or "I don't even remember, you know, my first memory is when I was, 8 years old, 7 years old." That's a red flag that something was so upsetting and chaotic in their very early childhood that they have blocked the memory of that. Most individuals can remember their first memories are, 4 or 5 years old, give or take. And most people can remember at least something about like their kindergarten years, their first grade years, their second grade year, even if it's just their teacher. Um, even if it's just sort of like the bad things that happen. We tend to have some memories that go back to around 4 or 5 years old. And when we don't, especially when it's like later and later and later, like that child developmentally would have been storing memories. So if the adult can't remember those things, there's a block that's happening. And that's usually for a self-protective reason. If we splinter off sensation, that's when you get sometimes people feel sort of numb in the world, like they're not very in tune with their body, or they'll describe feeling like they're a floating head going through the world. They're not they might even have parts of their body that completely are numb to them, like they can't really feel it. So that would be the sensation being dissociated. Affect can be dissociated as well, emotions. And sometimes it's one particular emotion, like anger. Like you'll talk to somebody and what they're describing to you is something that have made them really angry. And like you're angry on their behalf, right? But they're like, they just never get angry ever at anybody. And it makes them sort of a target for people who are going to abuse and exploit them, because anger is the emotion that wells up in us to give us enough energy to set boundaries, to realize that we've been wronged, and that we have that sense of like, hey, no, like that's not okay. For ourselves or for someone else, actually. Anger gives us that protective energy and boundary setting energy that we need. So the fact that somebody has dissociated that anger away completely and it can't get angry, is a sign that their boundaries have been violated so many times with such a threat of bad consequence if they were to, speak up or try to resist, that they've they've learned somewhere along the way that it's not okay to have anger. And so anger has to get stuffed away in a closet somewhere. Sometimes people dissociate emotions more generally, and they have a hard time sort of knowing what they're feeling. They say, "Hey, how are you feeling about that?" And it's like, well, I don't know, if you get kind of like it feels bad or it feels good, but it's not a lot of detail, and they can't quite put their finger on how they're feeling. So that's a layer of dissociation, and that has across all emotions. Lastly, behaviors. Um, so with trauma, sometimes there's repetition of traumatic experiences and patterns, and we call it trauma reenactment. But what this goes back to like Freudian psychodynamic theory, but like we tend to unconsciously repeat the patterns that we are trying to resolve. So like, let me try to come up with an example, right? So like, you know, if a person has an abandonment experience in childhood, like, oh, I remember my father walking out the door and he never came back, and he, left the family, and that hurt me really bad, and I saw that it hurt my mom, and you got all this unhealed, unfinished business about dad leaving, right? What we'll find sometimes is that a person is unconsciously drawn to partners who either they leave the partner, like, yeah, oh, everybody I get with ends up leaving me, or, and this is hard to wrap our minds around, but sometimes we because of the trauma reenactment impulse, sometimes we will push people away who then abandon us. And then we like, yep, see, everybody always leaves me. And it seems like why are we do it seems just like self-destructive, right? We're causing this thing to happen. We must, and sometimes people will say, oh, well, they must want that to happen. They must like that. And that is a really not understanding the dynamic at play. What's happening from a psychological perspective is we try to create the same situation so that we can have a different outcome. Like we need to fix the pattern, right? We can't go back in time and have the original wounding not happen. So we try to give ourselves a situation that's similar so that we can get a different outcome and hopefully kind of heal and resolve that very primary wound. All of this is happening mostly unconsciously. One of the things that happens in therapy is that we become aware of our patterns and our actions within those patterns. But I mentioned that because some of our clients are sometimes doing behaviors that on the face of it don't make sense. Like they're very confusing, they're very self-destructive. And sometimes the client is even saying like, oh, I keep doing this. I keep being drawn to all the worst people. I keep, I get myself to a certain place. I'm doing good. And then I self-sabotage, right? There's usually a piece in that, like I keep doing this same pattern over and over again, and then I mess up. And it's important to figure out what might be going on underneath that. Like, you know, if somebody's self-sabotaging, like, are they carrying around a really negative self-concept? Are they still holding on to this idea of that they aren't deserving of good things? Because if we try to make behavior change, but we don't make belief and thinking change, the behavior change tends to be kind of fragile, right? All it takes is for the beliefs or the thoughts to rear up and knock us off course, and then the behavior changes, right? We know that our thinking and our feelings tend to work together to drive whatever behaviors we do. So it's why it's really important to not only focus on behaviors, but also focus on thinking patterns and our underlying beliefs. And if we work on all three, the change that we create in our lives is actually a much more sturdy change. It's much more resilient to, the day-to-day life fluctuations. Okay, quick thought on depersonalization is kind of like not being sure that you are who you are. And this is kind of hard to picture when if we don't experience these things, but you feel a little outside yourself, and like sometimes people feel like they're just an actor on the stage, but not like a real person. Derealization is sort of the opposite, where you feel like the whole world and other people don't feel as real, and you kind of have a wonder of like, are you real? Because I don't know if you are. I'm not sure. It's almost like, is all of this that's going on around me more like TV, or am I in a movie and everybody's fake, but I'm a real person? And dissociative amnesia we talked about is like, really forgetting elements and details about the trauma itself. Dissociative fugue is, you may have heard of those rare cases where somebody sort of just walks off out of their life and almost like becomes like they find them, multiple states away. They don't know who they are. They just have no recollection of their life before. And it's just kind of like usually a pretty acute stress response. Something happens and they sort of snap into this full-blown dissociation. And it can last, I mean, I don't know what the average is, but it can be weeks, months. A person can be in a dissociative fugue for a long while. It's pretty rare, obviously, but it's an interesting psychological condition. At its core, dissociation is about the disconnecting from one thing and another. And we talked about it, it can be temporarily and it can be longer. It also, though, is the mechanism that we use for compartmentalization of memories, thoughts, emotions. And compartmentalization, like dissociation, can be, well, is a coping skill. It can even be a positive coping skill. We use it in the work all the time. Like we have what's going on in our lives out here, and then we're going to work. And to a certain extent, we have to put our life stuff to the side. Like, okay, I was arguing with my spouse this morning and we both had to go to work. And the argument is like, okay, I'm going to push the pause button on the argument. It's over here. I'll pick that up later. Right now, I have to focus on my work. And I've essentially then compartmentalized the thoughts, feelings, frustrations, whatever of an argument. It's not gone, but it becomes much less in the forefront of our consciousness. So that's compartmentalization. We do it all the time because we can't just be in whatever emotion is going on all the time. When we see clients who can't compartmentalize, what that looks like is any stressor, any challenge, any crisis is like right there. And they'll come in and it's like, oh, you're trying to get them to focus on their assessment or their case management plan or the thing that you thought they were supposed to be focusing on. And they're like all up in whatever drama is going on for them right now. Because they can't set it aside. They have not learned how to compartmentalize, and go, okay, yes, that was a thing. I do need to talk about that at some point, but right now I need to do this instead. Because compartmentalization is a skill set and a coping mechanism, but it's one that not everybody has in their toolkit. So it can be the way we create some space and stability for ourselves, even when things are going on. So it's a really important skill set to develop, even if we don't have it sort of naturally from our growing up experiences. Okay, a couple things here that will be in the slides for you. There are a lot of different self-report, paper and pencil questionnaires that seek to find out if a person is experiencing dissociation. The most commonly talked about, I think, is the first one, the dissociative experiences scale. But there are others. There are also clinician and parent rating scales. There's a clinician administered scale called the dissociative states scale. And then there's this is the most involved would be structured interviews for dissociative experiences. And that's usually when we use these when we're really concerned that somebody might be at the furthest end of the continuum where their dissociation is really interrupting their life functioning, and or we're trying to figure out if they have dissociative identity disorder. All right, so I wanted to introduce you to Bessel van der Kolk, if you haven't heard of him before. Big pioneer in the trauma recovery field. He's a psychiatrist type person and ended up doing a lot of work in the area of trauma. He wrote many books. He's written many books, and there's a lot of videos by him talking on YouTube if you want to delve deeper in that. But I wanted to introduce you to The Body Keeps the Score. I actually utilized this book in my Trauma 2 course because it just really gives and he uses a lot of case study vignettes to illustrate the psychological things he's talking about. So people find it a really interesting read because he's talking about patients that he's worked with different types of trauma and how that manifested in their physiology and their neurobiology. So the nutshell, so this is just a few key pieces from his early chapters in this book. Trauma produces actual body physiological changes, including in the brain. And we're going to talk about in neurobiology the recalibration of the brain's alarm system. So we all have the whole capacity to do fight or flight. When we've experienced a lot of trauma, the fight or flight mechanism isn't operating the same way. And we can end up with it either over alarming or under alarming. We also, whenever we have that alarm system going off, we have a lot more stress hormone activity. And we also have a harder time because our lens is changed. We have a harder time filtering out irrelevant information, and we start to kind of see trauma everywhere. Like we see possible trauma, possible danger in more and more and more places. It also can change the part of the brain that helps us feel, the word is embodied. Like we are in our body, we are grounded, we are centered, we have a feeling of well-being that comes from being able to be embodied and know on a real body granular level that we are here, we are okay. And when we lose that sense of embodiment, we also can lose our sense of, I feel safe in my own skin. I've had a lot of survivors describe it that way. Like, I don't feel safe ever. I don't feel safe in my own skin. I don't feel okay. Like there's just a pervasive sense of unease. And so he talks about an author that realized that even all the way back to 1941, that our symptoms have their origin. We talk about thoughts and feelings, but also we need to be thinking about what the body has stored from trauma and what the body is experiencing. So the mind, body, spirit thing that we all kind of hear about and know about and take for granted now took a long time to get into the psychological field because we didn't really focus on the body so much. We were only about the mind and the feelings. But it takes a lot of trust in yourself, first and foremost, and potentially in your provider, and a lot of courage to face traumatic memories or to face traumatic experiences. And he says in the book, it's hard for us to confront the shame about the ways we behaved during a traumatic episode. And sometimes that's like what I did or what I was told to do, and I followed that directive. But there's also just, I think, a shame that comes from being victimized because there's so much stigma and victim blaming in our society. And sometimes if there's an abuser, sometimes the abuser also says blaming, shaming things. But I think there's just, even at the core of it, there's this idea that if something bad happens to us, that we must have done something bad to make it happen, let it happen, or that we deserved it to happen. I forget what there's like the fallacy of, I forget what it's called right now, but like we believe in a just world. Like we're socialized to believe that bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. And if something bad happened to us, it must be because we did something wrong. It's also kind of in a lot of religious practice is like, this idea that, well, if you were living a good, upright, upstanding life, then bad things wouldn't come your way. And it really does a number on our head if we go through a traumatic experience. We internalize is the word we'd use. We internalize a lot of that shame and blame automatically, without even question. Rorschach tests, for those who aren't in the counseling field, are those ink blot tests. Sometimes they've appeared in movies and stuff. It's like a weird ink blot card, and then the patient is asked to say what comes to mind, what they see in the ink blot. And they're considered sort of like projective tests. Like, it helps us get at this underlying, like, what's your lens on the world. And what they learned from individuals who've gone through a lot of trauma is that they do sort of see danger and see bad stuff much more frequently than somebody who's experienced no trauma. So, for example, they'll hold up the ink blot, and a person who's never experienced trauma would say, "Oh, that looks like a butterfly." And then show it to somebody who's experienced trauma, and they say, "Oh, that looks like, the blood splatter on a wall." And it's like, whoa, that's two different interpretations of the exact same image. But it's because we sort of fill in these ambiguous pictures with what our brain is looking for, how it's seeing things as potential good or potential danger. So most of our therapeutic experiences and curricula are focused on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, which is very helpful to people who've experienced trauma. For some trauma survivors, especially those with complex PTSD, we also need to really weave in aspects that involve that sense of body and body safety. So that's why we get into the mindfulness, the grounding, and the being able to, even like breath work, can help somebody feel their body and start to come home to a sense that we live in this vessel, and that it can be safe. We can make more and more sure that it is safe and taken care of. Good, interesting chunk of the book talks about some of the neurobiology. And with the advent, so MRIs are an image of the brain, right? When you go in one of those little tubes, they push you in one of the little tubes, and it takes a scan of your brain. There's been development, though, in the field, and now they can do what they call a functional MRI, mostly in research. I've never had anybody experience one because their doctor ordered one, but in research, they can actually have people in the tube, and they can watch the brain change like they're watching a video. And God bless the volunteers who said they would do this research, because one of the things that they did was find people who had really active triggers for PTSD, and they volunteered to be in the tube and then be presented with stimulus statements that would trigger a flashback. I'm like, I would not want to be the person who's having a flashback in that little tube that's already really, like, the ceiling of it is really close to your face, and it makes all this banging noise. Like, it's stressful enough just to be in that thing. But they volunteered to do this, and what they were able to discover is which parts of the brain become activated during the fight or flight experience and what else is happening. So one thing that they found and could see is that the Broca's area of the brain, which is responsible for speech, being able to talk and say things, actually becomes very unfunctioning during a flashback, which makes sense if we've ever experienced one or worked with a client who's experiencing a full-blown flashback. They have a hard time, like, communicating with us. And what they realize is that, like, in some ways, all trauma, they call it all trauma, is pre-verbal. Like, being able to talk about it is something that we get to through a couple different, like we have to kind of work our way there. It's not an automatic ability. On the left is the brain when in a flashback. Look how much activity there is in that brain. And on the right is the brain in a functional MRI in the state of dissociation. I mean, the difference between those two scans could not be more dramatic, right? Like when somebody is just fully dissociated, they are really blanked out. Literally, the brain is fairly quiet. On the left side, all sorts of things are activating, and they're flooded with a lot of emotions and stimulus. What van der Kolk reasoned is that the balance between the alarm center, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking brain, shifts pretty radically. And it makes it much harder for people to stay regulated with their emotions and thus their impulses. So we have the top-down treatment that strengthens the thinking brain. That's a lot of the work that we do, right? And then the bottom-up work that really starts with the physiology of the body is through breath, movement, and touch, and the vagus nerve work that we do in somatic experiencing. And so you're sort of working both ways, top down and bottom up, for ideal results. This went for the class, certain things that they want to read to learn more. But I like this quote: being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. So we know that connection is really important for well-being for the person. It's really important for recovery, and it's really important for substance use recovery, but also for mental health recovery and trauma recovery. But at the fundamental level, also just being able to be embodied and feel what it is we're feeling, both sensory feeling and emotional feeling, is kind of the building blocks that we can work on with someone to help them be more available for those types of connections with other people. It's why group work is also really important as a modality. We tend to think about our group work almost like, well, like, okay, we're getting this information to the clients, right? But group work is also an interpersonal intervention, like how we facilitate clients experiencing each other and us as the facilitators is like that helps either teach the skills of connection or misses that opportunity. I mean, it really is about like the connection is one of the top 3 things we're working on with trauma survivors, helping them feel more connected in the world. Let's skip over that. Questions, thoughts, comments before I go on to neurobiology. I'll just bring up the main. You can type it in the chat or you can speak it out loud, but what do we got from that first part? What struck you? What questions do you have? What did you find interesting that maybe you hadn't thought about quite that way before? Is anybody out there? Oh, somebody's got their hand up. Yep. It just says G on my screen, but oh, Gal, yes.
It's me. I think one of the really interesting part is the physiological parts of trauma, because a lot of clients is like, why am I feeling this way? I shouldn't feel this way. Because they're like, they understand, maybe not all, maybe most of the parts of the mental stuff that are going on with them. They're like, okay, I'm disassociating, I'm like having flashbacks, stuff like that. But when something actually changes in your brain and you explain that to the clients and give them like psychoeducation about it, they actually feel so much better. So one time a client told me, so I'm not crazy. Like it wasn't just in my head.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very validating point for clients and really important to acknowledge.
Perfect. Yeah. You're segueing me perfectly into when we talk about the neurobiology. The reason that we created at the Healing Center the neurobiology seminar for clients was because of that exact realization of like, oh, these things that I've been struggling with are just a symptom of my trauma. I'm not crazy. I'm I'm not flawed. This is like, oh, this is why this is happening. And a little bit of like knowing that, what do we do to help stabilize that as well? So couldn't agree more that it helps clients, that psychoeducation about this information helps clients feel less out of control and just like, this is just happening to me and I don't understand it at all. Any other thoughts before we move forward?
I'm sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
I just thought it really spoke volumes to me personally and to help people that we work with that when you said we tend to unconsciously repeat the behaviors that we're trying to resolve, that was super alarming and impactful at the same time.
Fair enough. Yeah. It is disconcerting when we realize like, oh, wait a minute. I'm starting to see this as a whole full-blown pattern, and that I'm hopefully realizing it probably grew out of something from our past gives us a little bit more insight then on like, okay, what could that pattern be about for us? Because if we can figure out what it's about, then our efforts to sort of break the cycle become more targeted, right? We can figure out what we need to, maybe it's like, I mean, it's back to my abandonment example, for example. When we realize that like we do some grasping behaviors when we feel alone or lonely, we can go, oh, wait a minute. I see the grasping. I feel that grasping impulse. And what I'm going to do instead is fill that with friends and family and connection and like consciously learn to be at peace being with myself, have some solo time, some where I'm not running into the next behavior, right? I was actually just over the weekend talking with someone who has I think she's 16, and it's a girl who's experienced a lot of trauma, sexual trauma, and every time she feels like she feels not smart enough or not worthy enough or not pretty enough or whatever it might be, she immediately goes online and gets connected with some guy who will who's giving her a lot of positive, like, "Ooh, baby, you're so hot." And then she'll meet with that guy and have sex. Compulsive, almost like compulsively, like when I feel a sense of loneliness or not good enough, like I need that sexual attention. And for that moment, it's like, oh, I feel like I'm desired. I'm wanted. All good, right? But of course, right in the aftermath of that, when he's gone back to wherever he's at, here I am alone again. And that cycle of seeking attention, that whenever we're doing something external to try to meet self-esteem needs, it's always fleeting, right? It's always temporary. It's almost like chasing the drug, chasing the high, but on a self-esteem level. And when we realize that's the pattern, I mean, it's like, oh God, that's heavy, right? Like, oof. And then it's, what do I do about that? But the ideas of how we challenge that pattern are then much more specific than, oh, my self-esteem is low. What should I be doing? Well, I'm going to put affirmations on my mirror in the morning, right? Nothing wrong with affirmations, But affirmations aren't necessarily going to deal with that underlying pattern of seeking, you know, pseudo self-esteem through sex. Like that's what I'm talking about in terms of like figuring out what the pattern is, that it's an unconscious pattern. So we want to have real compassion and empathy for ourselves about whatever the pattern is, instead, because we can spend a whole lot of time being upset with ourselves for our patterns, and we burn up all of our energy is on feeling bad, which just makes us feel worse, which doesn't do anything to help the pattern, right? And almost always we want to differentiate between what are my actual emotions, like what are my feelings, and then what are my feelings about my feelings. And I tell you what, most of mental health troubles are about the feelings that we have about our feelings. So we can feel sad, but then we'll say, "Oh my God, I shouldn't be feeling sad because that's stupid," and like we all off on this really negative self-talk cascade about just feeling sad or just feeling angry. I feel really angry. I feel really scared. So when I think of feelings, I mean, we have the feeling wheels and all that, right? And the different, we've got a lot of stuff around feelings. And well, it's good we do, because most individuals don't get a whole lot on how to understand and manage feelings. Like we don't get that in our families necessarily. Some of us do, some of us don't. And it is very like important EQ 101 information. Like if you grow up in a family where feelings aren't really permitted, or parents are expressed different, like there's good feelings and there's bad feelings, and you better not express this and you better not express that. Like we get really disjointed about our ability to recognize and safely express feelings. So emotions work and affect regulation work is really good trauma work, but it's also almost everybody work. I mean, almost all of us could benefit from work around and within our emotions. And it's why it's woven into so many of our I have the light on, but then I'm in the dark, and then I'm in the sunshine. This is a bad time of day for these these virtual seminars. So all that work is really good and helpful work for survivors, because having the language of feelings and being able to identify and express what I'm feeling is really helpful to another person, as in my case manager or my counselor, and have them reflect back, yes, I hear it, I see it, and validate it. Like, yes, it's appropriate that you would be feeling what you're feeling, given what you are talking about, given what you went through. So that validation seems really basic, right? Like, of course you're angry that you were abused as a child, or of course you don't feel safe when you've got somebody who's actively trying to hurt you. But that validation of emotion can be really powerful for somebody who hasn't had their emotions validated very much, right? And it gives them that sense of, okay, I know what I'm feeling, I know what I'm thinking, I can trust myself. I can trust that I'm reading the situation accurately. And that's an important part of that embodiment that we were talking about. Okay. Thank you for those who shared. I'm going to switch over to cover some of the neurobiology. I don't know if we'll get through everything, but we'll just see. And again, created this ideally for clients. We used to do, where am I? Slideshow, current slide. Okay. Are you seeing neurobiology of trauma? Okay. I created this. We used to have Wednesday night seminars for survivors and any loved ones that they wanted to bring to learn more about different topics. And so neurobiology came up so often in the work, and like this fight or flight and PTSD reactions and stuff, that we actually just created it as one of our topics. And it was always one of the most attended topic nights of all the ones we did in the calendar. So we talk about fear, and especially anticipatory fear and anxiety. It's like, I know something's coming. I'm going to the dentist on Thursday, and I just know it's gonna hurt, right? We can have fear in anticipation of something. And then there's stress, which is sort of a ongoing physiological and emotional process when we're coping with something aversive. Now we talk about that there can be good stress and bad stress. So you can also be coping with, there's something good happening, but it's going to add, it's going to take a lot of time, or it's going to, change my life in some way. So that part of it is aversive, the change part or the added load. But most importantly, for survivors especially, is this idea of the physiologically based fear responses. And I love that they call these the 4 defensive reactions, because survivors tend to get caught up in that only fighting is defensive, right? We can get really into the fact that, well, I didn't fight, I didn't flee, I didn't do anything. Why didn't I do anything? Why didn't I tell anyone? Or that the fighting, the fleeing didn't work. And then somehow, because it didn't work, I didn't do it right. It's like very self-deprecating. So these 4 reactions tend to happen roughly in order, and it kind of makes sense, right? So first we freeze and scan. When we're presented with a potentially threatening stimulus, we freeze first and scan. And then if the threat is far enough away and we think we can escape, our brain might decide to try to flee. If we feel like we can't flee, the threat is too close, or they already are in contact. Like let's make this a real example. Leaving out of work and somebody's walking on the opposite side of the street, and they notice us when we walk out, and it seems like they may have not good intentions, right? So we're gonna notice them, and our brain, as soon as it picks up on the fact that there's somebody there who might be a threat, our brain is paying attention to what's going on with that person. If we are fearful to the point of like full fight or flight mode, we might go, oh my gosh, now that person's changed directions. They're coming my way, and they're coming my way quickly. If we feel like we can flee, like run back inside, or run and jump in our car, or run into an open doorway, that might be our impulse to run. If we're surprised though, and they're close, or they get a hold of us, for some of us, we might kick into fight mode. And the things that make people kick into fight mode is oftentimes previous experience with fighting. If you've never physically fought anyone in your whole life, you're very unlikely to jump into fight mode in a situation with an assailant. Like your brain's like not even registering that as a possibility. I mean, even law enforcement, they have to train over and over and over again to be able to go into fight mode when they need to, because the logical neurobiological experience can either stay in freeze or flee, or it can move into the 4th one, which is tonic immobility, where we just stay frozen and unable to kick into gear. So cops train and military people train over and over and over again to be able to fight when these other impulses are happening neurobiologically. But on the civilian level, the only really when they look at people who end up fighting assailants, they oftentimes have histories where they've already fought in other intense situations. So that it's in their toolbox essentially to be able to try to do that. There's a bit of a prohibition in our brains against fighting. And what I mean by that is our brains, the only thing our neurobiology is trying to do is keep us alive. Our brains don't care if we're going to feel embarrassed. Our brains don't care if we have an idea of ourselves as like this tough. I would fight in that situation. It really is automatically weighing our survival odds. If we flee, are we going to survive? If we fight, are we going to survive? And with fighting, if we register that we're more likely to escalate the violence that might happen. Like if I fight, this person might kill me. If I fight, they're going to be much more violent, right? If our brain is registering risk from fighting, it is very unlikely to utilize that strategy. And then once we are in a situation we cannot escape, the safest thing for us to do is to be in tonic immobility, frozen submission. And the idea is just like, in the animal kingdom, the possum plays dead and hopes that the predator loses interest and goes away. It's not satisfying as an answer. It's frustrating. It's demoralizing. It's scary. But our brains and these reactions that are built in are just for survival. It's just our brain trying to figure out what's the most likely strategy for us, the organism, to survive through whatever this experience is going to be. So for survivors, learning that and understanding why maybe they didn't scream or didn't fight or didn't run, that it was really more, first of all, it's not even a thinking process. This is an automatic process. It happens very quickly. I think some researcher said that decision of what to do in those circumstances happens in like 1/10 of a second. So it's absolutely a reflex thought, not a thinking thought. This is the brain and the key structures of the brain. And I just want to introduce it because that'll give us a good sense of where we're going when we finish this next time. But the amygdala is the alarm center of the brain. It's a little tiny part deep in the center, right at the end of the brainstem. And it sounds the alarm bell when we are going into fight or flight. With the frontal cortex is that whole newer part of the brain that's a thinking brain. And the HPA, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which I would not want to try to say multiple times fast, is where all the reaction part starts and happens for the fight or flight. And we've got the sympathetic response and the parasympathetic response. So we have a whole system that amps our body up when the alarm bell's ringing so that we can prepare to fight or flight. And we have a whole system that's designed to calm the body back down if we determine that either it wasn't actually a threat or the threat has now passed. So we're designed to be able to amp up and soothe down, and to end up at, when we amp up, we want to be able to come back down to what they consider sort of a baseline equilibrium. And in PTSD, with this happening so often over time, we actually get dysregulated in our ability to end up at that middle equilibrium. Sometimes we're amped up too much, sometimes we're down too much, and sometimes it's like moving and changing so often that we just are dysregulated for much of our conscious awareness. All right, so let's leave it there for today. Any comments in the, I'm going to stop sharing. Any comments or questions in the chat? Okay. I think we'll do another session for those who are interested. I think for the next one, we'll finish up neurobiology and the takeaways for therapeutic treatment or helpful coping skills based on the neurobiology. We'll also, I have a whole, I usually have a whole session on understanding perpetrator behavior. So we'll do the offenders PowerPoint as well. I find that it's really important for helpers to understand the dynamics that offenders use. And that by offenders, I mean sexual assault offenders, domestic violence offenders, and those who are both. So we examine the techniques and strategies based so that we understand both impacts on survivors that we might be working with, but also the ways that offenders act actually becomes part of the cognitive distortions and the self-defeating beliefs of the survivor. So knowing how perpetrators act helps us understand where survivors might be stuck. And of course, our goal is to help them get unstuck and to unravel whatever they've internalized from the abuser's words and actions. So we'll tackle those two next time, and probably I'll look and see if I have 2 weeks from today also free, and we'll send that out. But I appreciate everybody choosing to be here today and learn a little bit more about trauma stuff. So
Thank you, Mel.
yep. Any feedback or questions, you can also email me if you didn't want to put it in the chat, but otherwise I'll see you next time. All right. Take care, everybody.
You too.
Thanks, Mel.
Thank you.
You're welcome.